you can't imagine how daunting it is to be a non-technical person talking to a room full of technologists. But anyway, luckily my topic is culture, which is sort of like the one thing liberal arts majors are equipped to talk about. And I want to make one sort of big point, which is that to me, culture is as important, maybe more important than technology, right? And I say that from the perspective of a journalist. I covered technology companies for 20, 25 years. And also from the perspective of a lab rat. I spent a couple of years working in a tech company and wrote about it in a book that I was going to bring up and hold up in front of you. But anyway, a book called Disrupted, which was my experience of being an old guy working in a startup and trying to learn about startup culture, right? And I think when you're thinking about rebuilding technology, which is what you're all in the process of doing, you're also thinking about how that impacts culture and how you can change and shape culture, and how, in fact, I think technology actually shapes culture inside organizations. My book is called Disrupted because it's a double meaning. On the one hand, it's about my own life. I got disrupted in the middle of my career. But it's also about the economy at large, right? And I think we're living in a really exciting but also very terrifying time. We're living in a time when entire industries are being tipped upside down by technology. One of them was my own industry, the media business, right? And I think my sense from the outside is that organizations, legacy companies, for lack of a better word, are almost in a kind of panic, right? You look around and you say, we've got this infrastructure that was built in the 1990s, right? We're not nimble enough. We're not flexible enough. You know, on the HR front, we have a hard time recruiting millennials, right? And the world is changing, and you're at risk of being disrupted. And suddenly you feel that coming at you, right? We saw it in the media business, and for 10 years we just sat there like deers in the headlights, right? Just not knowing what to do. We froze, right? So you look around and you see all these little companies are coming at us, and no matter what business you're in, that's happening, right? Whether it's the media business or banking, right? You have these little startups, and they're very different, right? For one thing, they're all built on the cloud from day one. That's all they've ever known, right? They also look different, and they act different, right? They actually work in different ways. And the question then is, you know, what can we learn from them, right? And it's not surprising that we see a lot of companies, established companies, now racing out to San Francisco trying to emulate these startups, right? So you have companies like GE and BMW and Target and Comcast, and they're setting up shops in San Francisco, and they're building incubators or angel funds or VC firms, right? And the main thing is they want to be more innovative, and they somehow think that the secret sauce is in San Francisco, right? And they've also realized that innovation is somehow a function of culture. They seem to go together, but it's unclear how, right? The funny thing is that those guys are trying to copy San Francisco startups, but in a way, your job is actually way harder than a startup's job, right? Thomas Watson Sr., who's the founder of IBM, the original founder, famously once said, it's harder to keep a business great than it is to build it. This is at the point where he was handing the company off to his son. And I think that's true, right? A startup, in some ways, has a lot of advantages, right? They have the luxury, first of all, of being able to lose money, somewhat indefinitely, apparently, right? I'm not mentioning any names, Twitter, but, right, but, right? And they can focus entirely on growth, right? Just grow fast, lose money, go public, get the hell out before anybody notices, right? And they have a very short time horizon. These are not companies that have been around for decades and maybe are not necessarily intending to be around for decades, right? So what's happening in San Francisco, I used to call it Silicon Valley, but now it's all moved to San Francisco, right? In the past decade or so, we've seen the emergence of this thing that I call the new work, which is a very lame description. I just couldn't think of anything cool, right? But it's not just about using new tech products, but it's in how they operate, and it involves two things. The first one is a new kind of workplace, right? Now, I'm 55 years old, and if you told me when I began my career that by the end of my career, this is how people would look at work, like I would not have believed you, right? When I started my career, you went out, you bought a suit, a pair of wingtips, a tie, right? You were a big boy now, and you had an office, right? But But this is the new workplace. This is what people want to work in. Beneath that is something else, which is the New Deal, the new rules of engagement. And this is an age Rorschach test. Anybody who knows where this picture comes from is my age, right? And those of you who don't, well, sorry. So I spent 2 years working inside a startup, right? And I came out with some ideas about how they do things, what they're doing right, what they're doing wrong, what we can learn from them, right? And I wrote a book about it, right? And the short version is I think it's a mixed bag. I think there are some ideas that are great, that really work. There are some ideas that are sort of a wash, and there are some that I think are actually just dangerously bad. And the trick is to pick the right ones. And that's what I want to talk about. Now, before I do, I should add some caveats that I'm a comedy writer, right? So, yeah, I had a very good career going as a tech journalist, and at some point decided to blow it up by writing comedy about the tech industry instead of just writing about it straight. However, I actually think that San Francisco and the tech industry has become so crazy that in some ways the only way to write about it anymore is through parody and satire, right? So I started this blog where I pretended to be Steve Jobs smoking a bong and ranting about people, right? And that led me to work on this show, Silicon Valley, on HBO, which I like to call a docu-comedy, because, I mean, it's a comedy and it's very funny, but really, the guy who runs the show, the head writer, likes to say that, you know, we don't really have to make anything up. All we have to do is look around. We make field trips to Silicon Valley, we read blogs, and we take real stories and we put them in the show, and people don't believe it, and they think it's hilarious, right? So to all the vendors who are here, I want to just say thank you for the material. And to the venture capitalists who are coming up later, really thank you guys a lot. You guys are really the biggest source of information for us. But this is a show, for those of you who haven't seen it, it's a show where grown men ride fake unicorns and throw money around, right? It's a show that once presented probably the most inappropriate, nasty joke that's ever been broadcast on television in season 1. Those of you who are laughing know the joke. You saw the show. Those of you who don't, it's so inappropriate, I can't even describe it on stage. You just have to go back and watch season 1. There's a clue in the photo, though. I'll give you that. And then I wrote a book, and it has a picture of a grown man wearing a unicorn head, right? So you're thinking, this isn't very serious stuff. And I set out to write just a funny memoir about what it's like to be old and a curmudgeon and working in a startup. But when the book came out, people started reading it seriously and being like, hey, this is really kind of a book about corporate culture. Tom Peters, the guy who wrote In Search of Excellence, actually reached out to me and invited me to have lunch with him. I was like, whoa, okay, serious man, Tom Peters, right? And it actually is an attempt, especially in the middle chapters of the book, to take a serious look at Silicon Valley culture and to do it from the perspective of not a B-school professor or an academic and not a CEO, not a venture capitalist, but one of the worker bees, right? What's it like to be down in the trenches and experiencing the culture? I like to call it my disruption. This illustration was when the New York Times Book Review reviewed my book, they did this cartoon, which actually in one photo, one illustration totally sums up my experience, right? When you're guessing it did not go well, right? And the story of my disruption is this. In 2012, I was the technology editor of Newsweek. It was like the best job ever, right? And I was a print journalist. And to be a print journalist in 2012 was like being a blacksmith. And predictably, I got laid off, right? Now, I'm 52 years old. I have young kids because, stupidly, I waited too long to have kids, and now I have little kids, and I'm going to have to work till I'm 100 years old, right? So I'm 52 years old, and it's not just that my company's going out of business. The whole industry I'm in is collapsing, right? And I was kind of sick of the media business because I looked around and I saw it all falling apart, and I realized it was our own fault, right? We just ran out of ideas. We just didn't know how to cope with the internet. And in fact, we really still don't. So I thought, instead of working for yet another company that's kind of slowly going out of business, I'm gonna join the disruptors, right? I'm gonna go work at a startup. And I had written about startups, I had visited them, and for the last 5-10 years, every time I'd go to these places, they looked so cool and hip, and everybody seemed to be having so much fun. And I thought, you know, it would be great to work at a place like that that's growing, right? And I really wanted to reinvent myself, but I also saw myself kind of as an anthropologist, as like an ethnographer, right? So I'm studying this strange new tribe, right? But I really had bought into this mythology that startups had figured everything out, that they had invented a new way of doing things, a new way of working, right? So I went to a company called HubSpot in Cambridge. I live in Boston, so they're nearby. And they make marketing automation software, email campaigns, SEO stuff. This is the lobby. When I joined, they were 7 years old. They had 500 employees. They were moving toward an IPO. They were venture-backed. So they're not like a five guys in a garage kind of thing. This was a real going concern. The average worker was 26 years old, so I was exactly twice the age of the average employee. And what really intrigued me was that the two founders were two guys from MIT, and that they didn't just want to make a product or even build a company. They actually wanted to try to reinvent how companies operate. And they saw the company itself as a kind of laboratory, right? As a sort of experiment in organizational behavior. And they had done some things that were somewhat unconventional. One was that they hired almost nothing but recent college graduates. And I was a complete outlier. I didn't realize it until I got in there. But the other thing they did is they gave them pretty much no training. They just said, figure it out. And for the first 6 years, the company had no HR department, not even an HR person, because they kind of thought HR is kind of a 20th century idea, And what had evolved by the time I arrived was like a mix of a frat house, a kindergarten, and a Scientology cult meeting, right? And it was like an extreme example of startup culture, right? It was almost a parody of a startup. It was as if they took every crazy new idea that came out of San Francisco or that they read about, and they said, okay, we'll take one of those, two of those, right? So we had the cool headquarters that looked like a Montessori preschool. I don't know if you've noticed that when you go to these companies now. They all look, I had kids in a Montessori preschool at the time. I was like, oh my God, it looks just like the kindergarten that my kids go to, right? Toys, crayons. And everybody works out in these great big open spaces. Nobody has an office. That was like, you can't have an office. Nobody has an office, right? And every 3 months we had to change seats, like musical chairs, and they called it a seating hack, because in startups everything's a hack, Lunch is a hack, I'm gonna hack a sandwich, right? So, and the purpose of the seating hack, and they said this seriously, was we want to remind people that change is constant. It's like, I don't think changing chairs does that, but anyway. But they had some really cool stuff too. So we had flexible hours, right? You could work from home. We had unlimited vacation, right? Some progressive things, really cool. Really nice perks, right? We had dogs in the office because it's a rule now. Apparently you have to have dogs in an office. If nobody has a dog, you have to go buy a dog, let it run around in the office, right? We had beanbag chairs in the conference rooms. And the first time I saw this, I was like, there's no way I'm going to sit on a beanbag chair and have a meeting. There's no way a grown man can have a meeting and be taken seriously on a beanbag chair. But I found myself doing it. And we had bouncy ball chairs at the desks, on the rolling things. My first day I showed up and they didn't have a desk for me. They finally found me a desk. And it was like the dreaded bouncy ball on wheels. And I'm like, I'm going to fall off this thing, right? If I sit on this, I'm going to fall off this in front of a room full of millennials. But if I ask for a real chair, I'm going to look like an old guy. So what do? Finally, I asked for a chair, but kind of quietly, like on the down low, can you get me a real chair? There was a huge game room, right? We had ping pong, foosball, video games, shuffleboard. We had a kitchen stocked with free snacks, free beer, right? You had these sales bros who would be like, lacrosse players with the baseball hats on backwards and like the shorts and the flip-flops, like chugging beer at 2 and like hitting the phones, I was like, what the hell, right? Like, this is like crazy. They had one thing they were very proud of, and it was this thing, the candy wall, right? I swear to God, like day one, the guy's giving me a tour through, and he's like, we have to stop. It was like venerating, at a shrine. This is the candy wall. And it encapsulates our culture because we're fun. We're fun. We have candy, and it's free. You can have as much as you want. I was like, dude, I'll get diabetes. I can't have free candy. It means nothing to me, right? Unless I can take home entire bags of it and feed my kids with candy, which I can't, right? But they had a big Halloween party. This was the thing, and they say, we dare to be different. Every Halloween, but it was like a rule. You had to come to work in a costume. Everybody did this. They rode in on the T and the cars. They commuted in like dressed as vampires, right? And went to a big party. On Cinco de Mayo, they had another big party where they all dressed as sort of culturally insensitive stereotypes and drank tequila and ate Mexican food, right? So a little bit inappropriate. So I'm a little bit queasy, but I'm still thinking like, okay, maybe there's something here, right? And then this was the turning point for me. The boss had a teddy bear, right? The CTO, who was a co-founder, and he didn't just tell us about it. He put this on LinkedIn. He wrote an article about it. It had like 1 million views. It's like, my new innovation is we had to always solve for the customer. So I bring a teddy bear. I named her Molly, and she sits in a chair, and that's her next to the CMO, drinking a Red Bull, looking pissed off, And they would talk to a teddy bear, right? And I'm thinking like, okay, this is it, right? So, and what was weirder to me than that was that nobody laughed about this, right? Like at any place I worked, if at Newsweek the editor brought in a teddy bear and said, we're all going to talk to the teddy bear, I mean, it would be merciless, right? It would be horrible, right? There'd be bondage gear teddy bears. There'd be, you know, Smurfs, sodomizing teddy bears, right? So, but nobody here would laugh about it. I said to the dude across from me, I was like, buddy, dude, come on. That's crazy, right? He's like, no, I think it's great. And I was like, whoa. And I called a friend of mine, another journalist who went into marketing but at a big company, like a big PC company. And I was like, dude, they have a teddy bear. Is this what it's going to be like? Is this normal? He's like, dude, it's Jonestown. Get out of there, right? Like, no, this is not normal, right? Run right now, right? So I actually pitched the teddy bear idea last summer in LA, working on the TV show. And they said, you know what? It's too broad. No one would believe it. It's just too crazy. It's too heavy-handed. And I'm like, no, it's true. It's really happened, right? But the other big thing was they're obsessed with culture, and they made culture explicit, right? Talked about it. They wrote it down. They literally had a culture code. It was 128 PowerPoint slides written by the same co-founder who brought the teddy bear to work. He was a software developer. He spent 100 hours on this. He viewed this as a really important part of his job, right? They had a culture czar whose job was to enforce the culture code. Like it was like a VP, right? Whose job was culture, right? And they talked about culture fit, right? And culture fit was the most important thing in a startup, right? That you fit with the culture. Now, a lot of this sounds really ridiculous and silly and goofy, and it's really, the teddy bear is goofy, right? But I mean, it's very easy to goof on it. But here's the thing. It kind of worked. These are real people from HubSpot in a real picture, and this is kind of what they look like every day. They'd be jumping around. And the company was rated consistently one of the best places to work in Boston, often the best place. In Glassdoor, it's one of the top 10 places to work in the country. It has very, very high satisfaction. And some of these young people really got into this stuff, right? So like orange was the corporate culture, and they would come to work dressed in orange. They would buy company swag and wear that, or they would go buy some orange shoes or orange hats, orange shirts, orange sunglasses. And it wasn't an act, it was genuine. And I was kind of taken aback by this because I'm kind of a cynical old guy and I'm thinking this is all BS, but it works. It really works, right? And it occurred to me they had done something incredible, right? Like they had built this huge army of college-educated, enthusiastic, smart young people who were very happy and very loyal and worked very hard for not a lot of money, right? I have a friend at McKinsey who said, like, we should bottle that and sell that. Like, millennials will do anything for candy. But the turn of this is that it didn't really work. As I stayed longer, I started to realize something. One is that they had higher than average turnover, right? The employee turnover was higher than most companies would like to have. So people were happy for a while, but then they didn't stay, right? And the other problem was morale. They had uneven morale. It was never quite where the company wanted it to be, right? They would do these NPS surveys and Net Promoter Score surveys constantly asking about happiness. And they'd find that morale would be good over in marketing but bad in sales. Then it would be better in sales but bad in marketing. And they could never figure out why. But from the outside, or semi-inside, from my perspective, you see a company working really, really hard about culture and about perks and purpose and parties, and in some ways getting some results. The company was growing very fast, but in a bigger sense, it wasn't working. And this is happening across the startup world. There was a story yesterday or today about Palantir having problems with high turnover, right? It's somewhat endemic in Silicon Valley. They can attract talent, but they can't retain it. And I started wondering, where's the disconnect, right? And at the beginning, I talked about two things, the new workplace and the new deal, right? And the first one's great. The new workplace is a blast. It's fun. You know, you have parties, perks, and purpose. That's what I would call the 3 Ps, right? You have kitchens, beanbag chairs, standing desks, open workspace, dogs, cool decor. And the cool thing about that is it's actually pretty cheap, and it actually has a real payback, right? People like to feel like they're having fun at work, and you can scoff at it, but I think it's genuine, right? And we see companies racing off to copy that. This was a story in the New York Times recently about how ad agencies need young talent. They can't attract millennials. The millennials all want to work for startups. So they're like, cue the beanbag chairs. You know, we need to have beer pong on Thursday night, right? That'll get the millennials in, you know, the beer pong, right? The problem is that that stuff really isn't culture, right? All that surface stuff is what Amy Cuddy, who's a professor at Harvard Business School, calls pop-up culture. It's like instant culture. Add beanbags, add water, stir, now there's your culture, right? But the real culture exists in number 2, level 2, the New Deal, right? And that part, I began to realize, wasn't really always in alignment with the top part, right? The real culture was one where the job was actually very stressful. There was a lot of anxiety, and there was no job security, right? The sales reps would put on these monthly quotas. They would sit in a telemarketing room, hit the phone all day. It wasn't a quarterly quota or an annual quota, a monthly quota. And, you know, it was pretty difficult to hit. One person who worked in sales said to me, look, nobody can do this for very long. People burn out, and they know that. That's why they do it. She said, look around. There's nobody over 40 in this room. Nobody with kids in this room, because you can't have kids and do this job. This is a job that only a young single person who wants to build their life entirely around a company can do. And people will do that for a while. But either they miss their number and get cut, or they just can't take it and they burn out and they churn out. Even outside sales, in places like where I was, where there wasn't really a number to hit, there was still a lot of job insecurity because you had people getting fired all the time. Only in this cool startup-y thing, they called it graduation, right? And we get this cheery note that said, just want to let you all, hey team, it's always, hey team, we want to let you know that Derek has graduated, and we can't wait to see what he's going to do with his superpowers in his next big rock star ninja marketing adventure. And like usually those words, right? Like I'm not making that up, right? And this would happen all the time. People would just graduate. And you'd look over, you see, oh, the guy's desk is gone. He's missing. He's not there. They would just vanish like Spinal Tap drummers. Just boof, you know, boom, 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 right? And now, partly this is because you have bad managers. You have young people, you've put them into management roles, we haven't trained them, you have given them no adult supervision. It's not their fault, but they're trying to learn how to manage, so they hire badly, then they have to fire. People get fired on a whim. A woman got fired because they said she wasn't excited enough. It was 3 months in, you're not excited enough. And she was like right out of college. So like random stuff happens, but when you live in this lab rat experiment where this stuff happens, you start to realize, oh my God, lightning can strike at any time. I'm running through the maze, but it could hit me, right? So partly it was by accident or lack of attention to management, but partly it was by design. There was another philosophy called we're a team, not a family, right? And this idea originated at Netflix in their culture code, which we had copied, right? And now this too has spread throughout the Valley. It's become the new normal in the Valley is you're not coming here for a career, right? This is a tour of duty. You're going to do a year or two, then we're going to get rid of you, you know? So don't think of this as a transaction, right? We're not your family, you know? This is more like you're playing for the Red Sox. If a better shortstop comes along, we're going to trade you, right? Now, the reality of that is there's no reciprocity, right? The company is saying to the employees, we want loyalty from you, the kind of passion and loyalty that you would feel for your sports team that you love, but we're not going to owe any loyalty back to you, right? And the message, furthermore, was that people were disposable, like you're a widget, right? And the perks, which were really nice. You know, you could bring your dry cleaning in and take it out. That was nice. The perks don't really make up for all the other stuff, right? And I think part of the reason this happens, and this is where I want to talk to you about people and culture, is that I think a big problem with startups in Silicon Valley is that they're run by technocrats, right? And I know you're all technocrats, so don't take this the wrong way, but I mean, technocrats tend to think that they can solve every problem with technology, right? Even culture is something that they think can be created or optimized with technology, right? And they look at the organization as a kind of machine, right? It's software, it's code, right? And in that model, you can do things programmatically, right? You can write a culture code like our CTO did. It's just like writing a piece of software code, and you can install that in the organization, right? And then you iterate and you tweak it. You see what works, what doesn't. You patch things. You throw pieces out that don't work. And then you measure, right? So you take these relentless NPS surveys, right? And these were constant. What makes you happy? What makes you unhappy? Finally, I was like, dude, what makes us unhappy is the NPS surveys. You know, like, stop surveying us like lab rats, right? The intention of those is good, right? And there's lots of little apps now that you can roll out to your organization that just test people all the time for how happy they are, right? But it feels kind of impersonal, right? Because it's anonymous. There's a black box. Supposedly it's anonymous. I never trusted it. I never said anything bad. I always just gave 10s on everything, right? But which is, I think, the smart move. But it's anonymized, and there's like a black box between my boss and me, right? Between the organization and me. And somewhere on the other side of the controls, on the other black box, it's like one of those psychology experiments, are these little guys, and they're tweaking knobs going like, the data's coming in, these people aren't happy, add some tweaks over there, more free beer over here, you know? And I think you feel like you're being put into a machine and tinkered with, right? And there's an old idea that I think is actually a really good one called management by wandering around. And people of a certain age will remember this. It was something that Tom Peters wrote about in, my new best friend, Tom Peters. We hang out all the time. But he wrote about In Search of Excellence in 1982. And he had found this was something HP did back in the 70s, which was you managed people by wandering around and talking to them. Like, you don't need to survey them using technology. You can actually talk to them like human beings, right? So in some places, I think the pendulum is actually starting to swing back. I've been doing research for a new book about corporate culture, and I'm finding companies that are actually liking some of the perks and trying to blend that and look more up to date, but also trying to manage to keep some old rules of engagement that were good, you know, not throwing everything out. One company is Acquia, which is a company that a lot of you probably know. They're in Boston, and they just moved to a really hip new startup space, but they also have this concept of hiring using a metaphor of bond laddering, where you don't buy all your bonds in one, you know, with one maturity date. You buy a bunch so they mature in a row, in succession. And they try to hire people and have a spectrum of people from across the ages, right? And they're doing more with training. The CEO of Acquia said to me, look, most startups don't have time for training or money. We're just trying to pour money into growth, right? But in the last few years, he's decided, now he's 57, so he has a different perspective, but he's decided to pull back a little bit and to put some money into training, into development and management training, and career development, so that people will stay and build a career. I think another thing to do, and this is interesting as part of this work I've been doing, is I started looking to the past, right? And this is Thomas Watson Jr., who was the guy who took over IBM from his dad. IBM's philosophy is contained in 3 simple beliefs. I want to begin with the most important, our respect for the individual. This is 1963. It's a half century ago, right? And what's amazing is that, you know, the IBM of 1963 was a pretty damn good company. It was a very effective company. It grew 30% a year for 10 years in a row or something, and made money, right? They did both, you know? Another quote that I like is, again, from my new best friend, Tom Peters. And this is what he found. In 1982, In Search of Excellence was basically an exercise where he went out with another guy from McKinsey and said, let's find the best companies and find out what they do, what do they have in common, no matter what industry they're in. And what he found was the organizations that were successful thrive on intense communications, the family feeling, right? Not we're a team, not a family, but we know we're your family, right? The open door policies, informality, fluidity, and flexibility. And the crucial internal focus is the focus on people. And it feels weird to even be getting up and saying that, right? Oh, sorry, I'll go back, not yet. To even talk, to say that like you should focus on people, it sounds so obvious. And yet, I really think that this is something that Silicon Valley and startups have lost sight of, right? And it's ironic because right now, these companies consider themselves thought leaders in terms of culture. They probably spend more time in Silicon Valley talking about culture than any industry has ever done in all of human history, right? They're obsessed with culture, but they seem to have lost sight that culture is just about people, right? There's no way around it. And the other problem that they can't really solve is that people are biological creatures, and they're messy, and they have wives and kids and husbands, and they get sick. You know, they can't come to work for a while. I mean, it would be nice if you could just replace all the people and have all machines do all the work, but we really can't, right? And just treating people like meat puppets that get plugged into the machine until we can finally figure out a way to get rid of them and replace them with the machines is not a solution, right? So the perks are nice, but that's not really culture, right? Culture is how you treat people. I recently talked to the head of global talent acquisition at EMC, and she said a lot of things about multi-generational workforce, but one was that people want to be treated as individuals. And what they've found is that's not unique to millennials or to Gen X, it's just people. People want to be seen as individuals, right? And again, this sounds obvious, but yet we've kind of lost sight of it. So culture, I think, is actually at those levels, the rules of engagement between the employer and the employee, but even maybe at a level below that, to a level, real culture, I think, exists at a level that's almost subconscious. And I want to tell you a story about culture from one of the most unglamorous and the least high-tech industries in the world, and it's supermarkets, right? So there's a company in New England called Market Basket, or where I come from, we call it Market Basket, right? And I'll do the rest of this segment with my Boston accent on. And they operate a chain of 75 grocery stores, big supermarkets around New England. Now, these are low-end grocery stores. These are not like Whole Foods. These are like the anti-Whole Foods. You go to Market Basket because they sell Cheerios for 10 cents less than the guy across the street, right? That's their claim to fame, is low prices. They're not fancy. They're not always that nice. But anyway, we go there because we're cheap, right? And it's a family-owned business. It was started in 1917, meaning next year it's 100 years old, by two Greek immigrants named Demoulas. And the modern-day version began in 1954 when the two sons took it over. Now, over the decades after that, the family split into two halves, right? And one half ran the company. The other half had been bought out and felt that they had been cheated. And starting in 1990 to 2014, for 14 years, the angry, excluded half of the family starts suing the half of the family that's running the company. And finally, in 2014, they prevailed. I won't get into all the details, but they took over, they managed to get control of the board. A 5-person board, they had 3 seats. And the first thing they did was they fired their cousin, Arthur Demoulas, who was running the company. He's the CEO. And they said, we're going to bring in real execs. We're not going to be some half-assed family company. We're going to get a person from Albertsons, and we get a guy from Radio Shack, and we're going to run this like a business, right? That really wasn't a joke, but thank you for that. Thank you. You know something I don't about Radio Shack, I guess. Anyway, but here's what happened. This is really amazing, right? The employees went on strike, right? Warehouse workers, delivery truck drivers, right? Office workers in the corporate headquarters. It started with 8 execs who walked out, so we won't work for anybody unless you bring Arthur back. But then, little by little, they all started walking out. Some people still went to work, but they were right in the windows. Don't buy food here, like go away, And customers got the message, and customers started boycotting. And suddenly you had hundreds, thousands of people outside these stores in places like Chelsea, Mass., which is, if any of you are from the East Coast, Chelsea, Mass. Is a really kind of blue-collar, tough place, right? And they shut these stores down, right? The shelves were bare. There was nothing to buy, right? The management, the new management, the outside cousins were in, so we're going to fire all of you if you don't come back to work. And they held out, right? And eventually the CEO was reinstated. They won. And the CEO bought out the angry cousins for a lot of money and basically made them go away. Now, the people who went on strike, these are not like fancy people, right? These are not people who have savings that they can go afford to not work for 3 months or 6 months or a year, right? They certainly can't afford to get fired, and they're probably not the kind of people who are going to find it very easy to get a new job when they get fired. But yet they walked out for a CEO who's a millionaire, a multi-millionaire, a really rich guy, right? So why did they do this? And I think it was that these people felt a connection, right? This is a kind of company where people work for their entire life. You work their whole life, you become produce manager, then this, maybe you manage a store, and you retire, right? It's a place where multiple generations of the same family will work. I might get my nephew a job, and then he'll work there his whole life, right? These people felt valued, right? And to me, that's culture, right? There were no beanbag chairs, no teddy bears, no nap rooms, right? They didn't have a tequila tasting party on Thursday, right? This is a tough job working in a supermarket, right? There was no culture code and no culture czar, right? They didn't have to write down their culture code because they knew what the culture was. It was a real culture. And it wasn't an insta-culture. It took decades to evolve, right? And the main thing at the core of it was reciprocity. Whether they were right or wrong, these people believed that CEO, Arthur, cared about them as much as they cared about him, that they were part of his family and he would look out for them. And they didn't want to work for some impersonal company that didn't care about them. And I know it's easy to kind of laugh about a supermarket or to think that, like, if this guy looks like a dictator of a small foreign country, but, I'm sorry, he does. But, and maybe not the most sympathetic person in the world, really, but I ask you to ask yourself this. If your board fired your CEO, would you and your colleagues walk out for your CEO, right? If you got fired, would your department walk out for you? No, you don't have to answer it. It's a rhetorical question. But, and we all know the answer. Hell no, right? So I think that's the thing that startups in Silicon Valley have lost sight of. It's this concept of reciprocity, right? For them to say we're a team, not a family, is exactly the wrong thing to say, right? I don't want to turn this into bashing on startups, and there are some things that startups do really, really well, and I want to finish with those. One is that they make work fun, and they do the superficial stuff really, really well, and it shouldn't underestimate that stuff. The parties, the perks, the dry cleaning, the flexibility, work from home. Making work fun is a good thing, and they're really able to recruit millennials, and millennials bring a lot of energy and new ideas to an organization, right? It's really important. The other thing they do really, really well is this sense of mission. Now, it may be BS, and it's kind of touchy-feely, but I really get why people want to belong to something bigger than themselves. They want to feel that they're part of a mission and that their work has some purpose, right? Even if their work is cold calling prospects or writing blog posts or doing lead gen, I mean, they kind of want to feel that it means something, right? I think the way that applies to technology transformation is that when you roll out technology, you don't just teach people how to use the technology, you include them in the conversation about why we're using this technology, right? Why are we doing this? Why are we changing? Where are we going as a company, and why is this technology going to get us there? I don't think that has to be a big conversation, but I think it should be made explicit. And the third thing is that they make culture explicit. They talk about culture, probably too much, right? But they at least surface it. They make it something that they focus on. They make it important. They think about, what is our culture? Is it good? Is it bad? How could it be better, right? A lot of organizations don't do that. Startups kind of have the luxury of being able to start from scratch. You guys are inheriting a culture that might be decades old, but you might not even know what your culture is. I want to reiterate my opening point, which is that culture is, I used more than or equal to technology. That's my one nod to science. But I think technology maybe is more important than culture. Maybe culture is more important than technology. I think what really is the truth is that they're intertwined, and you can't have one without the other. And migrating technology without thinking about how you change the culture or how the technology is impacting your culture is pointless, right? You're just backing up the truck and dumping the technology in there and not talking about the people who are at the other end of the wire. So I'd leave you with this. You can take the best ideas from this new world, from the Silicon Valley world. You can go on these tours and visit startups and pick and choose the things you think work, right? You can combine it with new technology, none of which I understand. And then you can combine that with actually old ideas that came from a half century ago, but that are still really, really good. And you can create a culture that is respectful and diverse and treats people as individuals, but that's also nimble and fast and flexible and competitive. I don't think to become competitive, you have to forget about the people in your company. Quite the opposite. Right? And the most important thing about doing this blended approach is that you can create a culture that's sustainable, right? You're not just building a company that can grow fast, that can churn and burn and get through people and hire new people and get new people. You're going to build a company where people stay and last and contribute, and a company that can endure over time.